Hi, this is John Firth, and welcome to Firth and Friends. I'm here with my good friend Larry Reines, another executive coach, and we're going to talk about a topic that people are speaking a lot about, but I don't think there's a lot of thinking going on, which is really the hidden costs of a virtual workplace. Now, for a good year or two, we had no choice. Everybody had to be virtual except for the necessary the jobs that were considered necessary healthcare, in some cases, some construction, subway operators, bus operators to a limited extent. But now you have a choice. And companies are making that choice, and some are choosing to stay virtual. We'll talk about that for a second. And a lot of them have gone back by necessity to a physical workplace. So there are costs to both, and there are benefits to both. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Again, my name is John Firth. You'll see my email address underneath me next to my name, and you'll see Larry's name and his email address next to that. And again, this is the hidden costs of a virtual workplace. You lost more than just a water cooler, which I think hopefully is self-explanatory. So for me right now, we're going to start with talking about the balance of productivity and creativity. It's the sort of typical conversation you had around this. Certainly there's things to be said for both, but as a general rule of thumb, they say when you go virtual, you're more productive, but less creative. When you're in the office, because of distractions and what have you, you're more creative, but maybe less productive. Melissa Mayer at Yahoo, what was it, 8 or 9 years ago, kind of proved that point when she brought everybody back in the office to be, quote unquote, more creative. And she didn't get that. She got less productivity, and she didn't last very long. So that would be in my bailiwick that I'm going to argue it is good to stay virtual. In fact, in some industries you have to. But Larry has a different point of view. So Larry, if you could quickly introduce yourself and talk about your point of view.
Larry Reines from Aaron Meyer Consulting Group. And thank you, John. It's always a pleasure to chat with you and to share wisdom. So I'm gonna just bring up in recent months how some of the major companies, Twitter, Apple, Google, Snap, and General Motors, reversed their work from home policies in favor of one that required workers to be physically present all or a majority of the time. And the reason that we believe that's good, or I believe that's good, is that for some businesses, you need to have creativity, and creativity is what's the driving force and the point of difference. Bob Iger said this. He said, "It's my belief that working together more in person will benefit the company's creativity, culture, and our employees' careers. In a creative business like ours, nothing can replace the ability to connect, observe, and create with peers that comes from being physically together, nor the opportunity to grow professionally by learning from leaders and mentors." And I think that's in the creative business. And then when you go and you look at something like the financial industry and Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch of the like, they need to have people mentor them into the business to teach them what to do. You cannot get that unless you're there for the incidental conversations, the serendipitous conversations that happen when something happens or when you're walking by someone's office. So my conversation is based around the need to have that type of free contact, and that it's just so valuable to the point of difference that a business can offer.
Yeah, no, you make a good point about the serendipity. In fact, we were going to call this something around serendipity. I actually I thought that sounded a little bit ambiguous, but it is. We forget how important serendipity is to the business. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a second to see how you can replicate that in a virtual world. Now, I come from a profession, as do you, professional services. Coaching is a kind of professional services. And quite honestly, until 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said never, ever in a lifetime could I have been effective or even operated as an executive coach, a CEO coach, if I wasn't face-to-face. You have to read body language, you have to feel the energy in the room. And it was a hard transition. But now that I'm actually virtual or have that option, I have clients who don't have to be New York based, we had several of them in my Vistage group who moved away to Northwest Connecticut into Miami. And it works just as well. In fact, in some ways, it works better because you can have a more regular dialogue instead of doing it maybe once or twice a month, where you hop on a train and go there to meet them face to face. Now, that said, there's a lot to be said for being face to face with a new client to establish that trust, the thing that you can only establish when you're present. But most professional services companies and industries can survive fine virtually. I think of consulting, which was a virtual model already. You were very rarely in your home office or an office. You were at the client site. Now that's not virtual, you were physical. But all the issues that we're going to talk about in a second around culture and feeling loyalty and so forth, you feel very loyal to a company that rewards you well and gives you interesting things to do and allows you, in many cases, to stay at home to do your work if you're not at a client base. When I was running the strategy group of Hitachi Consulting, I would meet people from Missouri and Nebraska, wherever, and ask them this question. They had no home offices within 300 miles of where they were. Did that bother them? And they said, no, just the opposite. If they were forced to go into an office of the companies, even once a week, they would consider that a degradation of their decision, their private space. So there are industries, as I said, professional services, where being virtual has been commonplace. I think banking, where so much back office doesn't have to be done in an office, can be done at home. I think of lawyers who meet their clients now virtually. The whole trials will be virtual, will be over Zoom and not in person.
Yeah, there are industries or there are tasks based work that can be done virtually. That goes without saying. What we have to look at, though, is not getting caught up in this conversation about that's the panacea, that's the greatest thing to do, and that's working really well. Because the truth is that there are reports that you have a 70% improvement in efficiency. I think there's 10. You hear the improvement in productivity and efficiency of work. The question is what is the work, and if you're more productive, does that give you the point of difference, or does that just get more work done? And where's your little pixie dust or your point of difference? And is that going to come from someone not being with other people, right? So there's two separate tasks, two separate areas where, of course, there's some people that if they're doing tech support, when they're on a call, they don't need to be around people. Even when they finish a call, they don't need to be around people. They have support. But if you're in the financial services and you're an account executive and you're learning, to have someone senior to your left or to your right help you through the challenges, or for them to look at you and say, I just had this client and this is what I did. You will never get that virtually because there's not that instantaneous, oh, by the way, I should share this knowledge. A lot of what we do as coaches and our services industry is share knowledge, right? We're sharing from one to the other. Obviously, we're not specific by client, but we're sharing what's going on.
It's interesting you say that because the sharing. So I agree with you partially, and there's some things I'd like to push back on. The number of times I leave a physical meeting, get on the street and go, oh my God, I just thought of the point I wanted to make. Now, for some reason, doesn't seem to happen to me a lot when I'm online. I don't know why. But let's talk for a second about the nature of creativity and the nature of productivity. And maybe you've heard this, but a lot of my clients, we both work for the same basic client, which is business leaders, business owners, CEOs of small, medium-sized businesses. I get a lot of, I'm just not feeling productive. I just feel completely like I'm wasting my time. I spent 2 hours yesterday making a pie in the middle of the day. That can't be productive. But then you listen to what they did and what they've achieved, and then you think to yourself, okay, your mind's playing games with you. You actually achieved a lot. You just don't feel like you did.
Right.
And that's a pernicious thing, because I think one of the dangers of being virtual, one of the costs of being virtual, is the fact that you start having a skewed sense of self and of the world. that human contact, that ability to get out of your head really only happens when you're face to face. It's very easy right now. I'm sure you're partially in your head. I'm very much in my head thinking the next thing. If we were face to face, we probably would be less in our head. And I guarantee you, when I turn this off and I start getting ready for my next client, I would be totally in my head in a way I wouldn't be in a physical location where there are people around me.
So do you think it's better to be it's worse to be in your head?
I think it's generally worse.
It's worse.
Introverts, of course, do get more energy by themselves, but we know, and I know from a lot of work that I've done, I'm sure you have, is that it's those voices in your heads when they start going and they go in the wrong place. Like you think you've just made a mistake, or why is somebody not calling me back? When you don't have some interpersonal connection at that point where somebody walks by, let's just say you feel bad about something. I said something wrong in that conversation. Somebody walks by and you just immediately say, oh, let me go talk to them. Maybe they have an idea. If nothing else, I just get out of my head. That's literally virtually impossible to do when you're sitting in the four walls of your den.
Yeah, no, most of the time you self-talk, you want to turn that off and go into action immediately, because self-talk commonly stops you from doing things.
That's exactly one of the big dangers.
Rabbit holes of despair.
Or you do something even dumber than what you just did. It's the fight or flight. And the fight's just as useless as the flight. But I have to say, on my side, my general reaction is when I'm sitting here thinking is not to do something. That's where my concerns about productivity come. I'll write that email later. Or a distraction. So my general response is flight. Now, some people get really feisty. I still believe January 6th would have never happened had we had not COVID. Beforehand, you had a bunch of people who've been 11 months pretty much by themselves, and their brains just went haywire on them.
I agree. Idle hands are the devil's plaything, right? When you do. So let me just shift at this point to say my whole concept of free play, right? So free play is the idea that you get to go out and do things spontaneously. Hey, let's go play a game of basketball, and you pick up a few friends. Let's go play hopscotch. Let's jump rope. And you bring a group of people together to do something that's not a organized event. There are no rules. There are no clocks. There is no time frame. And what you have to do is negotiate everything that you're doing in order to have a successful, beneficial circumstance, right? So you can only have a great game if everyone agrees on the teams, if everyone agrees on the rules, if people are friendly about disputes. And it helps you socialize your way through things, and it helps you negotiate with people. So that there's two things that happen, is that you create a skill set of working with others, improving whatever culture you had, right? There's no authority to go to say, let someone else decide who's right and who's wrong so that I can be fixed, that type of free play spurs on the creativity, right? That's where you're able to get the game going. If you have an odd amount of people and you're playing basketball, you figure out how to get that other person involved. Why? Because you don't want to have a fight. You don't want to leave someone out. You want to do the best you can. The same thing goes in operating a business, right? If you don't have that free play or that serendipity or that incidental contact, how are people creating the culture in which to create a product or a service that's one step above competition? So if the competition's at home, they're not getting that incidental free play going. They're not getting that creativity. They might get more work done. They might have a better gross margin.
Even if you think you aren't, which is, of course, that weirdness.
Right.
But yeah, you may be more productive, but the creativity is such that incidental. That's kind of interesting. Let me break for just 1 second. You're watching You Lost More Than Just a Water Cooler, The Hidden Costs of a Virtual Workplace. And I'm John Firth here with Larry Reines. And please feel free to either make a comment or ask a question, or you can also contact us at the email addresses below. So let's talk about this culture issue, this also teaming. And quite honestly, I don't necessarily have an answer to this. I have some thoughts. How do you create a culture if, for example, some people never meet the CEO, or some people don't even meet members of their team, or in a startup situation, where, most CEOs don't start up a business thinking this is the culture I want to have, explicitly lay down the foundation. They usually start with an idea and people who they think can implement it with them. The culture thing comes, depending on how evolved you are as a leader, comes somewhere down the line. So what are the facets of culture that you think are particularly difficult, or how do you make it happen in a virtual world, perhaps, and where do we really have a problem in a virtual world with culture?
Well, it's hard for me to I don't know the answer to that, because for me, the success of most relationships and most sales cycles and most operational and most human contact is about rapport and understanding other people. And when you build rapport with people, you're able to get through a lot. You're able to communicate better. You're able to talk to people instead of at people. Creating a culture, you need to have that type of communication. You need to have the contact and the distribution of information and the distribution of vision. If the leader can't share the vision with their team virtually, then you shouldn't be virtual, because then you're not going to be a team. You're not going to be working in the same direction. If you're able
what does it mean, not being able to communicate in a virtual world? Because, with all this technology, at least the physical ability to do it, in other words, get on a Zoom call, do a video and so forth, is there.
It's very hard to build rapport with people only electronically.
Yeah, that I agree with. The rapport thing is a big one. And in our case, trust and rapport, right. And also loyalty. I think loyalty is very hard to build if you haven't established the rapport, which again, really, I think only happens when you are face to face. It's very easy to not get emotionally engaged on Zoom. And it's so important to the success, especially in a startup situation, of that emotional bond, that loyalty, that we're in it together. But that said, if we're looking at culture as culture, which I say is basically behaviors, certain behaviors, culture's there to give you an idea of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. In some cultures, it's acceptable to be loud and out there and say your opinion and not feel any backlash, to be entrepreneurial, make a decision, do it, and if it doesn't work out, you'll be excused. And there are other cultures that are more buttoned up, bankers and so forth. My answer to that part of it, behaviors, is by hiring properly, being clear on the people you hire and the behavioral attributes you're looking for, the presence they have, the aura, can I use the word aura, that special thing, the schools they went to, their education. When I was in consulting, I knew the consulting desk, strategy consulting, you hire at good universities. There's a personality, there's a type that will be successful. And I could do that virtually, although I never did back then. But if you get that right, the culture kind of starts happening because you have the right people.
No, so yes, but I think there's another dynamic behind that. Mm-hmm. So I am a proponent of using DISC assessments,
right,
to bring people in, so that you can tell by personality type of how people are, and why they are the way they are, if they'll be a good fit into their team. If you have too many dominant personalities in your team, you're not going to have a lot of
a team. You're going to have a bunch of dominant personalities,
basically. So there's where they went to school. I don't know if that's as important.
I was saying in consulting, and strategy consulting, that did play a role, because there's a kind of education that a good strategy consultant usually has, and it tends to be more liberal, artsy slash engineering, if you will.
Right. No, the same thing with a doctor, or when you get into certain professions, there are definitively qualifications that need to be the standard bearer and paramount in the hire. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about building teams, and of how do we get our team to work, and how do we get our visions to people, and that needs to be communicated. So the way people want to hear it, the way people listen, and the way you want it to be presented, and how you want them to represent you as well. Mm-hmm.
Well, so it's still really, this is, I think, the fascinating part of this conversation, which is the soft stuff, the soft costs of going virtual. You know, if you have a client base that's working virtual, then it really just becomes a question of how you behave, what culture you have when you're on the Zoom call. So it's sort of like, it's like in consulting, we used to say how you travel to your place of, to your client, or, you know, what class, economy or business or first class, is determined on, does your client travel like that? So you're trying to ape your client. So if you have clients who are virtual and are comfortable with it and want to maintain that, then it's probably good that you learn how to develop a virtual culture. But for me, again, culture is really behaviors, which become then, of course, communications and decisions, and how you. It's basically how you interface with the outside world. And so my question, I guess, is, you know, not a question, but the issue I think there is this command and control a little bit in industries in particular, but also just being physical. You know, physical presence plays a role. You know, I'm 6'4", and when I showed up physically, there was definitely a dynamic that I brought with me, being tall. And often I was told that's where sort of sense of authority came from. I once got a job and noticed everybody was tall. My first consulting job, and I asked the partner, did he do that on purpose? He said, well, yeah, and this was in Germany, by the way. Yes, tall people tend to command more authority, and we need that as consultants. So there is some of that, which we have to also learn to replicate. But how do you deal with clients, to employees, when you don't see them and they're off doing their thing and they may be talking to clients? And how do you ensure that your culture suddenly is living and breathing in the outside world when you're not there to see it?
Well, if you can't, I mean, there's a big disconnect in the humanity of what we do every day if we're not seeing people.
Right.
We need to see people.
But we also have to, there's certain expectations from a culture of how you behave, how you represent the culture.
Of course. I mean, there's the old story that we hear, and I don't even know where it started, about a boss was hiring a salesman or an employee, and they went out to dinner, and he watched how they ate, and he watched one person take the salt and put the salt on his food and gobble things up, and he saw the other guy taste his food before, and then he put some salt on. And just by that one specific action, he hired the one who tasted it first, because that means he's going to do discovery before.
Oh my God, that's a great story.
Right?
That's a great story.
So by just that interaction, so incidental, there's no test you can do online that would be able to pass the muster to say, hey, this person, look at their intuition and their soft skill of, I'm not going to put salt on anything until I eat it to see if it needs it. He's going to give the right policy prescription to anyone he's working with, because he's going to seek to understand. Right. And maybe that's not 100% true, but it's a good indicator of one's
well, it's what you lose when you're not physically present.
Correct.
Now it's interesting because when I'm interviewing candidates for my Vistage group or privately, we've been told at Vistage, or I learned from somewhere, maybe it was from you even, that the telephone is a better way to first meet someone, because you cut out that one sensory and you allow, which is the visual, and you allow the other sensory to be fully present, and that you actually make a connection better first time around over the phone than virtually. So I've gotten to the point now where I listen very intently to all sorts of things, sort of the equivalent to putting salt on or waiting before you put the salt on food. Certain things they say, the way they phrase it, do they pause before they answer something? I'm trying to think. I can tell when a conversation's over if there will be a second conversation or not because of me, but because of them.
Right.
I can just hear certain things in their voice or a certain phrase, which I may or may not have picked up when I was physically present with them. But it definitely, when you can't see someone, other senses begin to suddenly kick in, and you have to just be, I think, sensitive enough, literally, to be able to understand what you're experiencing when you can't see someone.
Right. No, I think that's brilliant, because when you do remove one sensory, others become sharper. when it comes to virtual, that's why I think that's my argument for being in person, right? You need some sensory feeling, like there's an aura of when you actually physically meet someone. Salt on the food.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I used to interview before, we would do it over Zoom. In fact, one of my less good hires was actually done with video conferencing. This was 20 years ago. And I never met her. And I took her as my assistant. She was problematic. And the reason why we did it that way was because she actually was moving from where she was. She was going to move to New York anyhow. I always thought to myself, if I had just met her physically beforehand, then it would have been, I would have noticed things. And it used to be really literally somebody would walk in my office and I can tell if this was going to be a serious conversation, somebody I would seriously consider hiring, or whether or not it was going to be one of those, I'm going to keep this as long as possible so it doesn't look like I'm thinking what I'm thinking. But, and that literally was a physical experience. I still can't totally replicate that on Zoom.
No, it's very hard. And to develop a meaningful culture, you need there are components of real life interaction that help. Again, the argument from the other side saying, well, you can do things virtually and then get there. You can. There's something about meeting someone and seeing their appearance and seeing everything about how they move and talk that creates a rapport that helps share and communicate the culture, that helps communicate expectations. It's just not, it's like our life is blocked into these time periods when you're virtual. Okay, when I'm virtual, I have 12 to 12:30, and then I have a bio break, and I have 12:45 to 1. And you're in blocks of time where you're sort of constrained, and that happens a little less.
Yeah, it's more fluid, I think, when you're in the office. What's interesting is you brought up the fact that maybe because we're more productive, quote unquote, is because we're able to structure it along a pathway that works for us, as opposed to a pathway that, oh my God, I've got 5 minutes between meetings that may not even be that important. So I'll try to get this done. Whereas here we have a lot more control over our time. The downside is for people who are used to structure, like I was when I went independent, is suddenly you're left with 24 hours that you have to figure out how you're going to put the structure in when you were used to having structure almost dictated. But yeah, I think those blocks of time, that kills creativity. I think when you think of blocks of time, you think of, all right, I'm going to get this done, this task, you get it done, and you shoot off the result or whatever. And there's really been no fermentation. There's been no discussion. So I think, having blocks of times doesn't help creativity. It really doesn't, in my mind.
For some positions, right? If you're in tech support, blocks of time works. I have to give only 10 minutes to this problem because there's a cost, a revenue analysis that you have to do to see that people being productive financially for you.
Yeah.
Commonly, there's so many jobs in so many companies that are not that task-based, where the productivity can take a hit to get creativity, because the point of difference for any investor or for any valuation of any company is far greater than their productivity.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's sometimes the creativity is the difference between getting it right and sort of getting it. I work a lot with the business model canvas, which takes apart any idea and starts to go through it, digs through and see what's the answer, what is the value proposition. I can't see that being done by somebody sitting in a room alone. You got to have input. You got to have people to talk to about that, bounce ideas off of, and serendipity plays a huge role in that, which I want to come back to really quickly. So I think there are some solutions that try to ape or try to recreate the serendipitous encounter in the office in the virtual world. Somebody was talking to me yesterday who said, well, you can actually do something that might be considered micromanagement in a physical world, which is just pop in and say hi to people. That sort of, if a CEO gives you a quick call, or you've got Slack open, or you have some sort of IM or texting. That shows the negative way to express it is it shows somebody's watching you. On the other thing, it's a nice replacement of walking the halls. You're kind of walking the virtual halls. You're seeing how somebody's doing. I find phone calls in this day and age are hard to justify because you've got so many other medium and you never know if somebody's going to pick up. But if you see your CEO calling you, you're probably going to pick it up, and it could just really be, hey, I want to check in. I heard something really interesting. Trying to maybe recreate that serendipitous encounter. Now, unfortunately, that is somewhat forced because a CEO, either it's going to happen or it's not. You can't call someone and expect a serendipitous encounter unless you've just heard something that you think is relatively important for the work that you know they're doing. So I do think there's ways to walk the hall, Slack channel being another one. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting as you're talking through it, and I'm self-talking to myself because I'm not in front of you. What happened in the old days, if you will? We would walk through the hall and we would have a report in our hand, or we'd have something we're working on, and we'd stop by Lou's office or Debbie's office, and we'd say hi, and you might say something, and there'd be a serendipitous interaction. Probably someone was being interrupted. Sort of no different than the CEO calling or hitting you up with a Slack saying, hey, what's going on? You know, Lou or Debbie might have been into something. They might not have been into something at that moment, but the moment was serendipitous, and there was probably some conversation that took on good meaning. And I think that can happen, though it's harder when you're not there because you could always, the distractions of being at home on the screen are tremendous. You could look at your phone. You could do, there's so many things that you could do.
Yeah.
When you're face to face, you're engaged. And I love engagement, and I believe in engagement for people.
Well, I think you're like me. Aren't you sort of both extrovert and introvert? You're sort of on the cusp.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, I'm not so sure this is true, but of course, extroverts get their energy from being in groups, i.e. being in the office. Introverts probably do better when they're by themselves, but I think that's just a gross generalization. I'm not entirely sure that holds. Yeah. But I do think of some encounters I had when I was at Discovery, which was very much a walk the hall sort of place. And it was obviously creative, it was the channel. And running into my boss completely by accident, not thinking about it, not realizing it was going to happen. You know, there's a moment of like, oh, we're by ourselves here in the hallway. And then I remembered something I had to ask her. Well, I'm carrying right now around with me maybe 4 or 5. Oh, I forgot. I've got to tell somebody something. And I've got to get in touch with them somehow. And that's just that little extra bit of energy that's required to no, I'm not going to see them. I have to reach out and say, are you available? You can't even call them these days because people don't pick up their phones. And there's not that much more work. Whereas if I could table something like that, know that if I go down to the cafeteria or start walking around, I'll probably run into a bunch of people that, oh God, I meant to talk to you. Here I have to write down, talk to this person. And it's just that's much more, the more reasons not to do it or to not have that happen.
Yeah, no, I actually totally resonate with that. Oh my God, I have a little pad ready to call John.
Yeah.
Or just pop off an email.
Or I should have called him last week.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it gets a little annoying, but we're sort of finishing up. Let's do a quick summary. I'll start with what I think the costs are of staying in physical. I think it's fairly obviously there's rent, there's utilities, there's in some cases you reimburse transportation. There's a physical issue around having your employees near an office. So the cost of actually, at least in senior management, moving a family, literally the cost of having to do that move for them so they can be near a physical space. There's the softer costs of distractions, maybe less productivity. Creativity is important, but sometimes it's very hard to quantify what that is. So there are a lot of costs of being physical. Now, that said, tell us a little bit about the costs of being virtual. And a lot of them are soft and cultural, but Maybe you can give us a list as a summary.
Yeah, no, and so it's a great question. So it's hard. The cost of being virtual is like, so if you take a look and see that we have Apple, Google, Snapchat, Disney, very creative companies, huge conglomerates, where the chief driver of the business says, we're losing something by people being virtual. The creativity portion of what we do is so important to us that we're willing to suffer from the productivity because we'll lose our point of difference. And for me, it all boils down to the point of difference. There's a cost in everything that we're doing when we operate a business. And when we put time into things that are just task-based, we're losing the creative-based. And when you lose the creative base, then your mousetrap's going to be like everyone else. And I think the success of a business is always build a better mousetrap. Creativity is paramount.
And I think what goes with it, one of the costs, and I've highlighted it a couple minutes ago, which is it's very hard to build rapport, to build loyalty, and to build trust if you never meet someone. Now, you and I haven't yet to meet, and we have developed a certain kind of rapport. If we met, who knows what might come out of it? That could be actually an even better idea than doing these LinkedIn Lives. But it is hard with boss employee and between employees to build that important loyalty. That means they'll go the extra mile for the organization and so forth. And I think that for me is the biggest danger of being distributed like this is it's so easy for an employee to say, oh, shiner object over there, I'm going to go work for them. Or I'm not going to be bothered. It's 5 p.m. and at 5 p.m. I'm finished. I think you just don't build that by being virtual.
Great.
Excellent. Well, thank you. It's fascinating as always, Larry. And hopefully one of these days
we'll
meet. Anyways.
Okay, let's just let everyone know. 2 years, yes? We know each other 2 years.
About 2 years, a little less than 2 years.
Hours upon hours. Throughout COVID, from the beginning, it's possible to have rapport virtually. But the thing is that we're colleagues and we coordinate our efforts in a lot of things, and we bring different perspectives. We're not producing one product, which is why we're not. If we were to have one product to create, we would be together.
We would have to get together. I would say the other thing is that, again, there's stuff that we probably would think of and co-create better if we were working together than here. It's very easy to just lapse into, oh, I like Larry, he's really interesting, I always learn something, as opposed to, well, Larry and I met, and this amazing idea just came up that I hadn't even thought of. So anyways, thank you for attending, and we will see you at another Firth and Friends shortly, every Thursday at 12 noon. We'll have rebroadcasts and then a new show every other week. So thank you for attending.
Thank you.